The fog rolled thick across San Francisco Bay on that October morning in 1964, wrapping Alcatraz Island in its cold, ghostly embrace. Ronald Thompson pulled his worn jacket tighter around his broad shoulders as he stepped off the maintenance boat, his work boots landing heavily on the wooden dock. At 38, Ronald's once black hair had begun to grey at the temples, and deep lines had formed around his eyes, evidence of a life that had seen more struggle than ease. 3 years had passed since the infamous prison had closed its doors, and now he was part of the skeleton maintenance crew tasked with keeping the abandoned structure from crumbling into the unforgiving waters that surrounded it. The island still held an eerie presence, as if the walls had absorbed the desperation of the men once confined within them, and Ronald often felt their silent observation as he went about his daily tasks. This morning, Ronald's assignment was to assess the stability of the foundations beneath Cell Block D, where recent winter storms had caused concerning cracks to appear in the basement level. He carried his toolbox in one hand and a flashlight in the other, nodding briefly to the security guard who barely acknowledged his presence. Ronald preferred it this way: minimal interaction, no unnecessary conversation. His troubled past had taught him the value of invisibility, of blending into the background. After 2 tours in Korea and a string of jobs lost to his occasional explosive temper, this solitary work on an abandoned prison island suited him perfectly. Here, the only ghosts he faced were those of strangers, not the ones from his own history that followed him like shadows. The basement of Cell Block D was a labyrinth of narrow corridors, pipes, and forgotten storage rooms. The air hung heavy with the smell of saltwater, mildew, and rust, the inevitable consequence of decades of exposure to the harsh marine environment. Ronald's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, dancing across walls streaked with water stains and peeling paint. The federal government was still deciding what to do with the island, and until then, it was his job to document problem areas and perform basic repairs. He made his way to the far corner where the structural concerns had been reported, his footsteps echoing in the empty space, the sound somehow both hollow and confined. As Ronald knelt to examine a particularly worrying crack in the concrete floor, something caught his attention, a slight difference in the echo when he tapped different sections with his hammer. He frowned, tapping again more deliberately. The sound was unmistakable. There was a void beneath this section of flooring. Curiosity piqued. He ran his fingers along the edge of the crack, noticing how it formed an almost perfect rectangle, roughly 6 feet by 4 feet. This wasn't a random structural failure. It looked intentional, like a sealed trapdoor. Ronald sat back on his heels, considering. The prison blueprints he'd studied never showed any access point in this location, and yet the evidence before him suggested otherwise. With growing interest, Ronald retrieved a pry bar from his toolbox and carefully worked it into the widest part of the crack. The concrete was old and already compromised, giving way more easily than he expected. Pieces crumbled under his efforts, revealing what appeared to be a rusted metal handle embedded in the underside of the concrete slab. His heart rate quickened as he cleared away more debris, exposing what was undeniably a trapdoor, concealed by a thin layer of concrete that had been poured over it, recently enough to crack, but long ago enough to weather and blend with the surrounding floor. Someone had intentionally hidden this entrance, and done so with considerable effort. Ronald hesitated, flashlight beam fixed on the revealed handle. Procedure dictated that he should report this immediately to his supervisor, a by-the-book former military man named Garrison, who would undoubtedly seal off the area and call in federal investigators. But something held him back, a combination of curiosity and an inexplicable feeling that whatever lay below was meant to be found by him specifically. He'd always had these intuitions, moments when the boundary between present and past seemed to thin, allowing him glimpses of things others couldn't see. His grandmother had called it the sight, a gift he'd tried to drink away after what he'd witnessed in Korea. Now, that same sensation tingled at the base of his skull, urging him forward rather than back. With a deep breath, Ronald gripped the rusted handle and pulled. Years of corrosion fought him, but gradually the trapdoor yielded with a low, grinding protest that seemed to reverberate through the empty prison. The opening revealed a narrow set of concrete stairs descending into absolute darkness. The air that rose from below was stagnant and cold, noticeably colder than the basement around him, carrying a scent that was unpleasantly familiar to Ronald from his war days, the lingering presence of long-absent humanity in an enclosed space. He played his flashlight down the stairs, but the beam couldn't penetrate far enough to reveal what waited at the bottom. Common sense told him to close the trapdoor and report his finding, but that persistent feeling that this discovery was somehow meant for him overrode caution. Taking a piece of wood from his toolbox to prop the heavy trapdoor open, Ronald began his descent. The stairs were crude but solid, carved directly into the bedrock of the island. He counted 17 steps before reaching the bottom, where he found himself in a narrow corridor that clearly had been hand-hewn from the island's natural limestone. This was no official prison structure. It had none of the institutional precision of the buildings above. This was something older, rougher, created with desperate hands rather than architectural plan. The walls bore scratch marks from primitive tool, and in places, what looked disturbingly like fingernail scratches. Ronald swallowed hard, playing his flashlight along the corridor, which extended about 30 feet before ending at a metal door that appeared significantly older than any other part of the prison he'd seen. The corridor walls bore no institutional markings. No numbers, no official designations, nothing to indicate this was part of the federal penitentiary that had operated from 1934 to 1963. Instead, here and there, Ronald's light revealed crude symbols etched into the stone, some resembling tally marks, others more complex designs he didn't recognize. The air grew colder as he approached the metal door, his breath now visible in the beam of his flashlight. The door itself was a puzzle. Unlike the modern steel doors used throughout the prison above, this one appeared to be made of riveted iron plates, with a locking mechanism that looked more appropriate for a 19th century jail than a modern maximum security facility. Ronald's knowledge of Alcatraz history, picked up through conversations with older staff members, reminded him that before becoming a federal penitentiary, the island had housed military prisoners dating back to the Civil War era. The lock on the iron door had long since yielded to corrosion, and when Ronald tentatively pushed against it, the door swung inward with a low moan that raised the hair on the back of his neck. He hesitated at the threshold, suddenly aware of how completely alone he was. No one knew where he was. If something happened to him down here, it might be hours before anyone noticed his absence. Despite this realization, he found himself stepping forward, drawn by that same inexplicable certainty that had guided him this far. The room beyond the door was roughly circular, perhaps 15 feet in diameter, with a ceiling so low that Ronald had to stoop slightly. His flashlight revealed walls lined with shelves carved directly into the rock, and on those shelves sat objects that made him freeze in place. Dozens of personal effects, meticulously arranged, preserved in the cool, dry air of this underground chamber. Ronald moved closer, examining the items with growing confusion. Faded photographs in simple frames, pocket watches, wedding rings, religious medals, handwritten letters tied with string, small notebooks filled with cramped writing, even a child's wooden toy soldier, each object carefully placed and inexplicably well preserved. These weren't institutional items, they were personal treasures, the kind of things a prisoner would value above all else. Yet official records stated that personal possessions were either stored in the administrative building or returned to families. Why would these items be hidden away in a secret chamber beneath the prison? And more disturbing still, why were there small labels attached to each item bearing names, numbers, and dates that spanned decades? Ronald picked up one of the notebooks, its leather cover cracked with age, and opened it to find a journal written in a shaky hand. The first entry was dated April 17th, 1912, and began, "They are watching me. They know what I saw. This may be my last chance to record the truth." The sound of shifting debris from the stairway startled Ronald, causing him to nearly drop the journal. He quickly returned it to its place on the shelf and turned toward the door, his heart pounding. Had someone followed him down? Was it Garrison or one of the other maintenance workers? But as he stood perfectly still, flashlight pointed at the doorway. No further sounds came. Just his imagination, he told himself, or perhaps the settling of the old structure above. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that he was no longer alone in this hidden chamber, that something had changed in the atmosphere around him. The air seemed to press against his skin now, and the silence had taken on a watchful quality. Ronald had experienced this sensation before, in the abandoned villages of Korea. The feeling of being in a place where terrible things had occurred, where the boundary between past and present wore thin. Shaking off the sensation, he decided he had seen enough for one day. He would return tomorrow with better light and perhaps some means to document what he had found. As he turned to leave, his flashlight beams swept across the far wall of the chamber, illuminating what he had missed upon entering. A crude mural painted directly onto the rock, depicting what appeared to be Alcatraz Island, but surrounded by figures floating in the bay waters, their arms reaching upward toward the prison cliffs. Ronald didn't report his discovery that day. He sealed the trapdoor as best he could, covering it with loose debris and a spare piece of plywood that he marked as a routine repair site. Throughout the remainder of his shift, he moved through his tasks mechanically, his mind constantly returning to the hidden chamber and its disturbing contents. The journal he had briefly examined haunted him most of all. Who had written those words, and what truth had they been so desperate to record? By the time he boarded the maintenance boat back to San Francisco that evening, Ronald had resolved to return and investigate further, away from the watchful eyes of Garrison and the other workers. He had always been a loner, keeping to himself in his modest apartment in the Mission District, but that night his isolation felt different, charged with purpose rather than empty with regret. The following morning, Ronald arrived at the maintenance dock 20 minutes earlier than usual, carrying a canvas bag containing his lunch, a camera he had purchased years ago but rarely used, several flashlights, and a small notebook of his own. The October fog was even thicker than the previous day, shrouding Alcatraz in a grey veil that seemed to separate it from the rest of the world. Perfect conditions for what he intended to do. He checked in with the security guard, mumbling something about early work on the plumbing system, and made his way quickly to cell block D. The basement was as empty and silent as before, and the makeshift cover over the trapdoor remained undisturbed. With a sense of both anticipation and dread, Ronald removed the plywood and descended once more into the hidden passageway beneath Alcatraz. Daylight made no difference in the underground chamber. The darkness was absolute without his flashlight. This time, Ronald had come prepared with a portable electric lantern that cast a steadier, wider beam than his standard-issue flashlight. Setting it in the center of the room, he began a more methodical examination of the space. The shelves carved into the rock walls held what he now estimated to be over 100 personal items, each with its own small identification tag. Moving clockwise around the room, Ronald began photographing everything, taking care to capture the tags attached to each object. He wasn't sure what he would do with this evidence, but something told him it was important to document it all before deciding his next steps. The tags followed a consistent format: a name, what appeared to be a prisoner number, and 2 dates separated by a dash. With a chill, Ronald realized the second date on many tags corresponded with notorious escape attempts or reported suicides. The journal he had briefly examined the day before drew him back like a magnet. Setting down his camera, Ronald carefully took the aged notebook from its place and sat cross-legged in the center of the chamber, beneath the glow of his lantern. The author identified himself in the early pages as Thomas Wilton, incarcerated at Alcatraz in 1911 for robbing a federal mail train. The early entries described the harsh conditions of the military prison that predated the federal penitentiary, but as the journal progressed, the content became increasingly disturbing. Wilton wrote of disappearances, prisoners who vanished overnight, their absences explained away as transfers or suicides despite no bodies being found. More disturbingly, he described guards leading selected inmates to the lower levels of the prison during the night, from which they never returned. Mullins was taken last night. One entry from September 1912 read, "They said he threw himself from the cliffs, but I heard his screams from below, not outside. They're lying. Whatever they're doing down there, it isn't natural." Ronald's hands grew cold as he continued reading. Wilton's writing became more frantic in later entries, describing how he had followed the guards one night and discovered a hidden entrance leading beneath the prison. He had witnessed something that he struggled to put into words, some kind of procedure involving prisoners who had been selected for their lack of family connections or outside interest in their whereabouts. The final entry, dated November 3rd, 1912, was written in a shaky, hurried hand. "They know I saw them. Fletcher, presumably a guard, looked at me today with such hatred I thought he might kill me where I stood. I've hidden this journal where they won't find it, along with the evidence I've collected. If I disappear tomorrow, let whoever finds this know that Alcatraz hides more than prisoners. They're experimenting on us. God help me, I've seen what becomes of the subjects, and death would be kinder." The journal ended there, the remaining pages blank. Thomas Wilton had apparently never had the chance to write again. Ronald closed the journal, his mind reeling. He looked around at the other objects in the chamber with new understanding. These weren't just random personal effects. They were mementos of prisoners who had disappeared under suspicious circumstances. Someone had collected and preserved these items, maintaining this secret memorial for decades. But who? And why hide it all away like this? The mural on the far wall drew his attention again, and he moved closer to examine it. The painted figures in the water surrounding Alcatraz weren't swimming or drowning as he had first assumed. They were emerging from the depths, their bodies distorted in unsettling ways that the primitive artistic style couldn't fully disguise. At the bottom of the mural, barely visible in the uneven light, Ronald discovered a signature and date: T. Wilton, 1912. The journal author himself had painted this disturbing scene. Replacing the journal and continuing his examination of the chamber, Ronald discovered a small recess behind one of the shelves, concealed by a loose stone. Inside was a metal box, roughly the size of a cigar container, sealed tight against the damp air. With careful fingers, he pried it open to find a stack of yellowed papers and several small glass vials containing what appeared to be soil or sand samples, each labeled with different locations around the island. The papers were a mixture of hand-drawn maps of Alcatraz, showing areas marked with cryptic symbols and what looked like medical notes written in a precise clinical hand, detailing physiological changes and transformation rates in subjects identified only by numbers. The language was technical enough that Ronald struggled to understand much of it, but the tone was unmistakably detached, describing human beings as experimental material. One page included sketches of human anatomy, with areas circled and annotated with terms like primary manifestation site and accelerated tissue alteration. The implications were too disturbing to fully process. Ronald had heard rumors about unethical medical experiments conducted on prisoners in various institutions during the early to mid-20th century, but nothing specifically about Alcatraz. Was it possible that beneath the official history of America's most notorious prison lay an even darker secret, some kind of unauthorized experimentation program? If so, who had been responsible? And more importantly, had it ended with the military prison or continued into the federal penitentiary era? The dates on some of the identification tags extended well into the 1950s, suggesting that whatever had happened here had continued for decades, perhaps ending only when Alcatraz closed as a federal prison in 1963. Ronald carefully replaced the metal box in its hiding place, feeling the weight of his discovery pressing down on him like the rock above his head. As he continued photographing the chamber's contents, Ronald noticed something he had overlooked during his first visit: a small ventilation shaft near the ceiling, roughly 8 inches in diameter, which appeared to connect to the prison's main ventilation system. This explained how the chamber had remained relatively dry and preserved despite its proximity to the bay waters that surrounded the island. It also suggested that the chamber's creators had intended it to be used long-term, not simply as a temporary hiding place. The craftsmanship of the shelves and the careful arrangement of the items indicated that this was a deliberate memorial, maintained over time by someone or several people who had wanted to preserve evidence of whatever had occurred beneath Alcatraz. Ronald wondered if there were still people alive who knew about this place, perhaps former guards or administrators who had chosen to hide the truth rather than expose it. Time slipped away as Ronald documented everything he could, filling his notebook with descriptions and observations, using almost an entire roll of film on his camera. He had been so absorbed in his investigation that he failed to notice how many hours had passed until his flashlight beam caught his watch face. It was nearly noon, and he was expected to check in with Garrison at 12:30. Reluctantly, he gathered his equipment, taking one last look around the chamber. As he turned to leave, a sudden draft caused the lantern flame to flicker, casting moving shadows across the mural on the wall. For just a moment, in that shifting light, the painted figures seemed to writhe and reach toward him, and Ronald could have sworn he heard a faint, collective moan emanating from the ventilation shaft, a sound so low and brief he immediately doubted he had heard it at all. Unsettled, he hurried back to the stairway, his footsteps echoing in the narrow corridor. The remainder of that day passed in a haze for Ronald, his mind constantly returning to what he had discovered. He went through the motions of his assigned tasks, avoiding conversation more than usual, fearful that his face might betray the tumult of his thoughts. During his lunch break, he sat alone on a bench overlooking the bay, staring at the fog-shrouded waters and wondering what to do with the knowledge he now possessed. Going to Garrison seemed pointless. His supervisor was a government man through and through, more likely to confiscate Ronald's evidence and bury the truth deeper than to help expose it. The local authorities would probably dismiss him as a conspiracy theorist, especially given his history of psychological issues following his military service. A newspaper might listen, but without more concrete evidence, they too might question his credibility. As the afternoon wore on, Ronald decided that he needed to return to the chamber at least once more, to gather more convincing proof before approaching anyone with his story. That night, in his small apartment, Ronald developed the photographs he had taken in his makeshift darkroom, a converted closet with equipment he had purchased years ago during a brief period when photography had seemed like it might become more than a casual interest. As the images emerged from the chemical bath, he felt a renewed shock at what he had discovered. Seeing the chamber's contents captured on film made it all more real somehow, more undeniable. He spread the photographs across his kitchen table, arranging them by type: the personal items, the journal pages he had photographed, the mural, the documents from the metal box. Together, they told a fragmented story of systematic disappearances spanning decades, of human experimentation conducted in secret beneath one of America's most closely monitored federal institutions. But significant gaps remained. Who had been responsible? What exactly had been done to the missing prisoners? And perhaps most importantly, why had someone created and maintained this hidden memorial? As Ronald stared at the photographs, a peculiar sensation began to creep over him, a feeling of being watched that he had experienced occasionally since his return from Korea. He glanced at his apartment windows, confirming that the blinds were closed, then tried to shake off the paranoia as a product of his exhausted mind and the disturbing nature of his discovery. Yet the feeling persisted, accompanied now by an almost imperceptible whisper at the edge of his hearing, like multiple voices speaking just softly enough that he couldn't make out the words. Ronald pressed his palms against his eyes, wondering if he was experiencing the beginning of another episode, like those that had led to his discharge from the army, periods of dissociation and auditory hallucinations that military doctors had attributed to combat stress. But when he lowered his hands and opened his eyes, the whispers stopped, and his gaze fell on one particular photograph, a close-up of the mural, in which the distorted figures in the water seemed somehow clearer than they had in person. their faces captured in expressions of what could only be described as transcendent agony. The following day was Saturday, and Ronald was not scheduled to work at Alcatraz. Instead of the relief he would normally feel at having a day away from the island, he found himself restless and anxious, unable to focus on anything but the hidden chamber and its secrets. The photographs he had developed were spread across his kitchen table, some now marked with his handwritten notes, as he attempted to organize what he knew and identify the questions that remained unanswered. A pattern had emerged from the dates on the identification tags. The disappearances seemed to cluster around specific periods, often coinciding with phases of the moon, though Ronald wasn't sure if this was significant or merely coincidental. More tellingly, the frequency of these vanishings had increased during wartime periods: the Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, and the Korean War, suggesting some connection to military interests rather than purely criminal justice concern. By mid-morning, Ronald had made a decision. He would return to Alcatraz that night, outside of working hours. As a maintenance worker, he had access to a set of keys that would allow him entry to the main buildings, ostensibly for emergency repairs. He had never used this privilege for personal purposes before, but the need to gather more information overrode his usual adherence to rules. He spent the day preparing, collecting better photography equipment borrowed from a neighbor, extra batteries for his flashlights, and a small tape recorder he had purchased during his lunch break. If he was going to expose whatever had happened beneath Alcatraz, he needed irrefutable evidence, the kind that would compel authorities to investigate rather than dismiss his claims as the delusions of a troubled veteran. The boat ride to Alcatraz that night was tense. Ronald had waited until after the last tourist ferry had departed, then used his maintenance credentials to convince a reluctant night watchman to transport him to the island, claiming a burst pipe required immediate attention. The watchman, an older man more interested in returning to his newspaper than questioning Ronald's story, had agreed to pick him up again in 3 hours. Plenty of time, Ronald hoped, to thoroughly document the chamber and perhaps discover additional evidence elsewhere in the basement levels. The island was eerily quiet as he made his way up from the dock, the abandoned prison buildings looming like monoliths against the night sky. A nearly full moon broke occasionally through the clouds, casting sharp shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources, making Ronald's journey across the parade ground towards Cell Block D an exercise in controlled fear. Inside the prison, the darkness was nearly absolute. Ronald's flashlight beam seemed swallowed by the emptiness of corridors that had once echoed with the sounds of hundreds of men in confined rage and despair. He moved quickly, familiarity guiding him through the maze of cell blocks until he reached the basement entrance of Block D. Each step down the concrete stairs increased the pressure in his chest, not just anxiety about being discovered, but a deeper dread that seemed to emanate from the building itself, as if Alcatraz were somehow aware of his intrusion and his intentions to expose its darkest secret. At the bottom of the stairs, Ronald paused, listening. The silence was profound, disturbed only by the distant sound of waves against the island's rocky shore and the occasional creak of the old building settling. Taking a deep breath, he proceeded to the hidden trapdoor, still covered with the plywood he had placed 2 days earlier. This time, the trapdoor seemed heavier, more resistant to his efforts, as if something on the other side were pushing back. Ronald attributed this to his own fatigue and heightened anxiety, forcing himself to remain rational as he finally managed to lift the concrete slab. The darkness below seemed more intense than before, almost solid in its blackness. As he descended the 17 steps, flashlight leading the way, Ronald was struck by a change in the atmosphere. The air was noticeably warmer than on his previous visits and carried a different scent, something organic and vaguely unpleasant, like rotting vegetation. At the bottom of the stairs, he paused again, playing his light along the narrow corridor. Nothing appeared different, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that the space had been disturbed in his absence. Reaching the iron door to the chamber, Ronald found it slightly ajar, though he was certain he had closed it firmly when he left. His first thought was that someone else, perhaps Garrison or another worker, had discovered the hidden passage and investigated. But as he pushed the door open wider and stepped into the circular room, the beam of his flashlight revealed a scene that stopped him cold. The neat arrangement of personal items on the shelves had been disrupted, with several objects now lying on the floor, as if swept there by an impatient hand. The journal he had read was open, its pages ruffled, and most disturbingly, the mural on the far wall appeared different. The painted figures seemed more distinct, their distorted forms more clearly defined, though Ronald tried to tell himself this was simply the effect of his stronger flashlight, revealing details he had missed before. Setting up his equipment with shaking hands, Ronald began to document the changes, speaking quietly into his tape recorder, describing the altered state of the chamber and his own theories about who might have discovered the space. As he worked, a new sound gradually became apparent, a soft, rhythmic dripping coming from somewhere nearby. Following the noise, Ronald discovered a thin crack in the rock wall behind one of the shelves, through which water was seeping, forming a small puddle on the floor. This was unexpected. The chamber had been remarkably dry on his previous visits, protected from the island's pervasive dampness. Something had changed in the structural integrity of the space, allowing bay water to infiltrate. As he examined the crack more closely, Ronald noticed that the seeping liquid had an unusual consistency, thicker than water, and a faint phosphorescent quality that became apparent when he dimmed his flashlight. This wasn't ordinary seawater. It had properties he couldn't explain. Increasingly uneasy, but determined to complete his documentation, Ronald turned his attention back to the shelves and their contents. He began photographing the disturbed items, noting their original positions from memory. When he reached for the journal, intending to photograph additional pages, he noticed something he had somehow overlooked during his previous examination: a folded piece of paper tucked into the back cover. Carefully extracting it, he found a letter written in the same hand as the journal entries, but dated several days after the final journal entry. It was addressed simply to whoever finds this, and began with a startling declaration: "If you are reading this, then I have become like the others, taken below for whatever unholy purpose they serve. I have hidden this journal and the evidence I've collected in hopes that someday someone will expose the truth of what happens beneath Alcatraz. They are not simply killing us, they are changing us." Vitison, the letter went on to describe how Thomas Wilton had secretly followed the guards during one of their midnight retrievals, witnessing them taking a prisoner down to a level even deeper than the chamber Ronald now stood in, a natural cavern beneath the island that extended below the bay waters. According to Wilton, the military had discovered this cavern during the initial fortress construction in the mid-1800s, along with something in the waters that surrounded it, something they had subsequently spent decades studying, using prisoners as unwilling test subjects. Wilton's descriptions became increasingly fragmented and difficult to follow, referring to the change and those who returned to the waters transformed, but never explicitly stating what he had seen. The letter concluded with a warning that chilled Ronald to his core. "They will know you have been here. They always know. The waters speak to them, and now they will speak of you. If you value your soul, seal this place and never return. Some truths are too terrible to bear." Ronald's hands trembled as he folded the letter and returned it to the journal. The dripping sound had increased in tempo, and he noticed with alarm that the puddle of phosphorescent liquid had grown significantly, beginning to spread across the chamber floor in thin rivulets that seemed to move with purpose, rather than simply following the natural contours of the stone. A new sound joined the dripping, a soft, wet slithering from the direction of the crack in the wall, which Ronald now saw had widened perceptibly since he'd first noticed it. His instincts screamed at him to flee, but he forced himself to continue his documentation, quickly photographing the letter and gathering the most compelling evidence items to take with him: the journal, the metal box with its medical notes, and a few of the smaller personal effects with their identification tags intact. As Ronald hastily packed these items into his bag, the atmosphere in the chamber changed dramatically. The temperature rose several degrees in a matter of seconds, and the air became thick with humidity, making it difficult to breathe. The slithering sound intensified, and to his horror, Ronald saw something beginning to emerge from the widened crack, something glistening and pale that pulsed with the same phosphorescent quality as the liquid spreading across the floor. He backed toward the door, his documentation forgotten in the face of primal fear. The thing continuing to push through the crack defied easy description. Neither fully solid nor liquid, it appeared to be composed of multiple smaller entities moving in concert, like a colony of translucent creatures fused together into a larger mass. As it advanced into the chamber, Ronald became aware of whispers filling his mind, not heard with his ears, but somehow projected directly into his consciousness. Hundreds of voices speaking simultaneously in a disorienting cacophony of pleas, warnings, and sounds that had no equivalent in human language. Ronald stumbled backward through the iron door, slamming it shut with strength born of terror. The whispers didn't stop. If anything, they intensified, now accompanied by a pressure against the door, as if something substantial were pushing from the other side. He fled down the corridor toward the stairs, his flashlight beam dancing wildly across the stone walls, briefly illuminating carvings he hadn't noticed before. Symbols similar to those in the mural, but more elaborate, covering every available surface in what he now recognized as wards or protective sigils of some kind. Reaching the bottom of the stairs, Ronald looked up to see a figure silhouetted against the dim light from the basement above, a human shape watching him from the top of the stairway. For a moment, he froze, caught between the horror behind and the unknown ahead, until the figure spoke. "You shouldn't have come back, Thompson." The voice belonged to Garrison. "What is this place? What's down there?" Ronald demanded, his voice unsteady as he began to climb the stairs, desperate to put distance between himself and whatever was now audibly moving through the corridor behind him. Garrison didn't move from his position blocking the exit, his expression unreadable in the shadows. "Something that should have stayed buried," he replied, his tone oddly flat. "We've maintained the seal for decades, until you had to go poking around." Ronald was close enough now to see Garrison's face, and what he saw there sent a new wave of fear through him. The man's eyes had a strange, milky quality, and his skin glistened with moisture despite the dry air of the basement. "You're one of them," Ronald whispered, the realization hitting him with the force of physical blow. "You've been changed." Garrison's laugh held no humor, only a deep weariness. "Not yet, not fully, but I hear them, just as you're beginning to hear them now. We all do, eventually, those of us who know about the depths. It starts with dreams, then whispers when you're awake. They call it the summoning, the pull back to the waters." He stepped aside, allowing Ronald to reach the top of the stairs. "You can't stop it, you know. What's happening to the island, what's been happening for over a century. The government thinks they contained it when they closed the prison, but they just removed the human buffer. Now there's nothing to feed it except the waters, and that's never been enough." Ronald clutched his bag containing the evidence tightly to his chest, edging past Garrison toward the relative safety of the basement proper. "I'm going to expose this," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Whatever's happened here, whatever's been covered up, people deserve to know." The boat ride back to San Francisco was a blur for Ronald, his mind reeling from what he had witnessed and Garrison's cryptic words. The night watchman who had transported him noticed his distress, but attributed it to the generally unsettling atmosphere of the abandoned prison, making a half-hearted joke about ghosts that Ronald couldn't even pretend to laugh at. By the time he reached his apartment, it was past midnight, and a bone-deep exhaustion had settled over him, combined with a hypervigilance that made every shadow seem threatening, every sound a potential warning. He double-locked his door, drew all the blinds, and spread his collected evidence across the kitchen table under the harsh light of the overhead bulb. The journal, the medical notes, the personal items, and most importantly, the rolls of film that documented everything he had seen in the hidden chamber. Sleep was impossible. Ronald spent the remainder of the night organizing his findings and planning his next steps. By dawn, he He had decided to approach a journalist he had read in the San Francisco Chronicle, a reporter named Catherine Walsh, who specialized in government accountability stories and had recently published a series on unethical medical research conducted by federal agencies. Walsh had a reputation for thoroughness and integrity. If anyone would take his discovery seriously and investigate properly, it would be her. He would need to be careful, of course. After his encounter with Garrison, Ronald had no doubt that others connected to Alcatraz knew about the chamber and whatever lay beyond it, and would act to silence him if they discovered his intentions. He would make copies of everything, store them in different locations, create insurance against interference. Sunday passed in a fever of activity as Ronald developed the new photographs, made copies of the journal and notes, and composed a detailed account of everything he had discovered and experienced. The images from the second visit were even more disturbing than the first batch. The changed mural now clearly showed figures that were only partially human, their bodies in various stages of some unthinkable transformation. And the photographs of the crack in the wall, with the phosphorescent substance seeping through, captured a small portion of the entity he had glimpsed, enough to prove he hadn't imagined it, but not enough to reveal its true nature. As he worked, Ronald became increasingly aware of a subtle but persistent sound at the edge of his hearing, the same whispers he had experienced in the chamber, now following him back to the mainland, growing louder whenever his attention wandered from his task. Monday morning, Ronald called in sick to work, something he had rarely done in his 3 years of employment at Alcatraz. The maintenance supervisor sounded suspicious, but didn't press the issue. Ronald then contacted the San Francisco Chronicle, asking to speak with Catherine Walsh. To his relief, she agreed to meet him that afternoon at a small cafe in North Beach, away from both the newspaper offices and his own neighborhood. Gathering his most compelling evidence, the journal, select photographs, and a concise written summary of his discoveries, Ronald headed to the meeting, constantly checking to ensure he wasn't being followed. The cafe was busy enough to provide anonymity, but quiet enough for private conversation, and he selected a table in the corner, positioning himself to view both the entrance and the street outside. Catherine Walsh arrived precisely on time, a tall woman in her mid-40s with shrewd eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that put Ronald slightly at ease. After brief introductions, he began to explain his discovery, starting with finding the trapdoor and progressing through his exploration of the chamber and its contents. Walsh listened without interruption, taking occasional notes, but mostly maintaining eye contact, her expression revealing neither belief nor skepticism. When Ronald mentioned Thomas Wilton's journal and the disappearances, she nodded slightly, as if confirming something she already suspected. Only when he described the entity emerging from the crack in the wall did her professional composure slip, a flash of alarm crossing her features before she controlled it. "May I see the evidence you've brought?" she asked when he had finished, her voice carefully neutral. Ronald passed her the folder containing the photographs and documents. As Walsh examined each item methodically, her initial skepticism visibly gave way to genuine concern. She lingered over the medical notes, her brow furrowing as she read the clinical descriptions of physiological changes in the test subjects. "These procedures," she said finally, looking up at Ronald, "they match reports I've received about classified military research conducted in the 1940s and 50s, experiments related to underwater survival and adaptation that went well beyond ethical boundaries. I've been investigating similar allegations connected to other facilities, but never had concrete evidence." She paused, studying one of the photographs of the mural. "But this suggests something far more disturbing than even those accounts indicated. Will you help me expose it?" Ronald asked, leaning forward intently. "I have more evidence in secure locations, enough to force an official investigation." Walsh didn't answer immediately, her gaze drifting to the cafe window where late afternoon fog was beginning to roll in from the bay. "Mr. Thompson," she said finally, "I've built my career on exposing government misconduct, but I've learned to be extremely cautious about extraordinary claims. What you've shown me today is compelling, disturbing, and potentially significant. But Publishing it without additional corroboration would be irresponsible journalism and potentially dangerous for both of us. She raised a hand to forestall his protest. I'm not dismissing your evidence. I'm suggesting we proceed carefully, gather more information, and build an irrefutable case before going public. Walsh proposed a plan. She would use her contacts to research the military history of Alcatraz, focusing on periods corresponding to the dates Ronald had found in the chamber. She would also look into personnel records, trying to trace Thomas Wilton and other names from the identification tags. Meanwhile, Ronald would continue his work at Alcatraz, maintaining his normal routine to avoid suspicion while being alert for any additional evidence or unusual activities. They would meet again in 1 week to share their findings and determine next steps. It was a sensible approach, and under normal circumstances, Ronald would have agreed without hesitation. But the whispers that had followed him from the island were growing louder, more insistent, and he couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out, that whatever had been contained beneath Alcatraz for decades was awakening, accelerated perhaps by his discovery of the chamber and disturbance of its contents. Over the next few days, Ronald's mental state deteriorated rapidly. He returned to work at Alcatraz, forcing himself to act normally despite the constant fear that Garrison or others might confront him about his nocturnal investigation. The whispers that had begun as barely perceptible now formed a continuous background murmur in his mind, occasionally coalescing into recognizable words or phrases. Mostly pleas for help or release, but sometimes darker messages that he tried desperately to ignore. Worse, he began to experience brief visual hallucinations, glimpses of pale, distorted forms at the corners of his vision, gone when he turned to look directly. At night, his dreams were invaded by visions of the bay waters, which in his sleep he could somehow see through. Perceiving vast shapes moving in the depths beneath Alcatraz, pulsing with the same phosphorescent glow as the substance in the hidden chamber. By Thursday, Ronald could no longer distinguish between the symptoms of psychological breakdown, something he had experienced before after Korea, and the possibility that he was actually perceiving something real, something connected to whatever lay beneath Alcatraz. His work suffered as he struggled to concentrate, earning him concerned looks from colleagues and a warning from his supervisor about his performance. That afternoon, he noticed Garrison watching him from across the yard, the older man's expression unreadable, but his attention unmistakably fixed on Ronald. When their eyes met briefly, Ronald felt a jolt of recognition pass between them, a shared awareness of the whispers, the visions, the growing connection to whatever dwelled in the depth. Garrison nodded once, almost imperceptibly, then turned and walked away, leaving Ronald with the unsettling certainty that his former supervisor was further along the path of change than he had initially realized. Friday morning brought a new development that shattered what remained of Ronald's composure. The front page of the San Francisco Chronicle featured a small article reporting that Catherine Walsh, investigative journalist, had been reported missing by her colleagues after failing to return from a research trip to an undisclosed location. The article mentioned that Walsh had been working on a sensitive story related to historical government misconduct, but provided no details about her current assignment or last known whereabouts. Ronald read the piece with growing horror, immediately connecting her disappearance to their meeting and the evidence he had shared with her. Someone had discovered their communication and acted to silence her, which meant they likely knew about him as well, and his time was running short. Driven by desperation and a growing sense that he was being manipulated by forces beyond his understanding, Ronald made a decision that would irrevocably alter the course of his life. Instead of reporting to work that morning, he gathered all the evidence he had collected, the photographs, documents, personal items from the chamber, and his own detailed notes, and headed to the San Francisco Public Library. There, he spent hours at a microfilm machine, researching historical records of Alcatraz, cross-referencing the names and dates from the identification tags with official prison records and newspaper articles about inmates who had allegedly escaped or committed suicide. The pattern was unmistakable once he knew what to look for. Dozens of prisoners over decades, officially listed as dead or escaped, but whose bodies were never recovered from the bay waters surrounding the island. The official explanation had always been that the strong currents carried bodies out to sea, but Ronald now understood the far more disturbing truth. Those prisoners hadn't escaped into the bay. They had been taken into the depths beneath it. As afternoon faded into evening, Ronald left the library with a clearer understanding of the historical context of his discovery, but no better plan for exposing it safely. The whispers in his mind had grown to a constant chorus, making concentration difficult, and twice during his research he had experienced moments of lost time, minutes or perhaps longer when he had apparently continued to function but had no memory of what he had done or seen. He was losing control, just as Thomas Wilton had described in his final journal entries. Whatever influence emanated from beneath Alcatraz was growing stronger, perhaps because he had breached the chamber that had contained it, perhaps because he carried with him objects connected to its past victims. As he walked through the foggy streets toward his apartment, Ronald felt eyes on him from every shadow, every passing car, every window overlooking the sidewalk. Not just human surveillance, but something else, something that observed through borrowed senses. Reaching his apartment building, Ronald immediately sensed that something was wrong. The front door, which was typically secured, stood slightly ajar, and the usual sounds of his neighbors were absent, the building unnaturally quiet for early evening. He should have turned and fled, but exhaustion and a fatalistic acceptance of what was coming propelled him forward up the stairs to his third-floor apartment. The door was unlocked, the interior dark, despite the setting sun that should have cast light through his west-facing windows. As he stepped inside, the whispers in his mind reached a crescendo, then abruptly ceased, leaving a silence so profound it seemed to have physical weight. In that silence, a familiar voice spoke from the darkness of his living room. "You should have heeded my warning, Thompson." Garrison sat in Ronald's armchair, his outline barely visible in the gloom. As Ronald's eyes adjusted, he could see that his former supervisor had changed significantly since their encounter on Alcatraz. Garrison's skin had a slick, almost translucent quality, and his eyes had lost all color, becoming milky orbs that nonetheless seemed to perceive Ronald with perfect clarity. "They sent me to bring you back," Garrison said, his voice carrying an odd liquid quality that hadn't been present before. "You've been chosen, just as I was years ago. The change has already begun in you. Surely you've felt it, the whispers, the visions, the pull toward the water." Ronald backed toward the door, but found his way blocked by two men in nondescript suits who had appeared silently behind him. Government agents, he assumed, though their stillness and coordinated movements suggested they too had been altered in some fundamental way. "What do you want from me?" Ronald asked, though he already knew the answer. Garrison rose from the chair with a fluidity that was both graceful and deeply unsettling, as if his joints no longer functioned according to human limitations. "It's not what we want, Thompson. It's what they need. The entities beneath Alcatraz have existed there since before human settlement, living in symbiosis with the natural environment. The military discovered them accidentally during fortress construction and recognized their unique properties. An arrangement was made, regular human subjects in exchange for biological knowledge that advanced medical science by decades. The program was official until 1963, when changing ethical standards forced it underground. He gestured around the apartment, where Ronald now noticed that all of his carefully gathered evidence had been collected and piled on the kitchen table. "Your discovery threatened to expose everything, just when a new phase was beginning." "New phase," Ronald echoed, fighting to keep his mind clear as the whispers began to return, more insistent than ever. Garrison's smile was terrible to behold, his teeth visible through lips that had grown strangely thin. "Evolution, Thompson. Adaptation. The entities are changing, becoming more capable of direct interaction with our world. They need intermediaries, humans who can serve as bridges between their consciousness and ours." The journalist understood too much, asked too many questions, but you've shown remarkable receptivity to their influence. They've chosen you as they chose me years ago and others before us. One of the suited men moved forward, producing a syringe filled with pale, slightly luminescent liquid. "This will ease the transition. The first changes are difficult without assistance." In that moment, faced with the horror of what awaited him, Ronald made his final choice. With a sudden burst of desperate energy, he lunged toward the kitchen table, seizing a handful of photographs and the journal, not to save as evidence, but as a connection to Thomas Wilton and the others who had been taken before him, a talisman against the loss of self that Garrison's transformation represented. The suited men moved with inhuman speed to restrain him, but Ronald had anticipated this, using his momentum to carry them all toward the apartment window. Glass shattered as they crashed through, plummeting toward the street 3 floors below. In the suspended moment of freefall, Ronald experienced a strange clarity. The whispers resolved into distinct voices, each telling its own story of capture, experimentation, and transformation. He understood now that these were the victims from the chamber, their consciousness preserved somehow in the process that had changed them, reaching out to him not in threat, but in warning and shared suffering. Ronald survived the fall, though with injuries severe enough to hospitalize him for several weeks. The official report described the incident as a suicide attempt resulting from psychological problems related to his military service, a convenient explanation that few questioned, especially when his medical records from the VA hospital were made public, detailing his previous episodes of paranoia and auditory hallucinations. The men who had been with him in the apartment were never mentioned, and when Ronald tried to tell his story to hospital staff, his words were dismissed as delusions, his claims about Alcatraz attributed to an obsession with his workplace, combined with his deteriorating mental state. The journal and photographs he had grabbed in those final moments disappeared from his personal effects during his hospital stay, removing the last physical evidence of what he had discovered. Upon his release from the hospital, Ronald found that his employment at Alcatraz had been terminated due to his extended absence and concerns about his mental fitness for the job. His apartment had been cleared out, his lease terminated, his possessions placed in storage, all arranged, he was told, by a concerned relative who had since returned to the East Coast. With nowhere else to go and no resources beyond a small severance payment, Ronald took a room in a boarding house in the Mission District, his view of Alcatraz Island blocked by intervening buildings. A small mercy, as the sight of it now filled him with both dread and an inexplicable longing. The whispers continued, but more distant now, as if whatever influence had been reaching for him had temporarily withdrawn, perhaps assuming that his credibility had been thoroughly destroyed and the threat he posed neutralized. In the months that followed, Ronald attempted to rebuild some semblance of a normal life. He found work as a janitor at a small manufacturing plant, a position that required minimal interaction with others and no security clearance or background check that might flag his psychiatric history. He avoided the waterfront and any news related to Alcatraz, which was beginning to be discussed as a potential tourist attraction now that its days as a federal prison were over. He spoke to no one about what he had discovered, not even when reports began to appear in local papers about unusual phenomena in the bay. Strange lights seen beneath the water near Alcatraz, unexplained equipment failures on boats that ventured too close to the island after dark, a commercial diver who emerged from a routine inspection of the underwater foundations claiming to have seen something moving in a cave beneath the island's eastern side. But avoidance and silence offered only temporary refuge. As winter gave way to spring in 1965, Ronald began to experience physical changes that no amount of denial could explain away. An increasing sensitivity to light that made the daytime hours painful, a developing translucence to his skin in certain areas, and most disturbingly, webbing beginning to form between his fingers, which he took to hiding with gloves despite the mild San Francisco weather. The whispers returned stronger than ever, now accompanied by vivid dreams in which he swam through the dark waters beneath Alcatraz, his body moving with inhuman grace through passages that led to vast, submerged chambers where others like him gathered around, pulsing organic structures that defied description. He would wake from these dreams gasping, his bedsheet soaked not with sweat but with a salty moisture that reminded him too much of bay water. On a fog-shrouded morning in April 1965, Ronald Thompson disappeared from his boarding house room, leaving behind most of his meager possessions, but taking with him a notebook filled with increasingly fragmented writings about Alcatraz, the entities beneath it, and his own ongoing transformation. His landlady reported his disappearance to the police, but given his history of mental instability and the lack of any signs of foul play, the investigation was cursory at best. A brief article appeared in the local section of the San Francisco Chronicle, noting the disappearance and mentioning his former employment at Alcatraz as a point of human interest. But the story generated little attention or follow-up. Like Catherine Walsh before him, Ronald simply vanished from public record, his fate a matter of speculation for the few who had known him during his final months in San Francisco. That same evening, as darkness fell over the bay, a solitary figure could be seen standing on the rocks at Land's End, gazing out toward Alcatraz Island. Had anyone been close enough to observe him clearly, they might have noticed his unusual appearance. The pallor of his skin, the strange configuration of his hands, the total absence of expression on his face. For hours he remained motionless, watching as lights appeared beneath the waters surrounding the distant island, pulsing in patterns that seemed to be responses to the rhythms of the ocean itself. Then, with a fluid movement that no human body could achieve, the figure that had once been Ronald Thompson slipped into the cold waters of the bay and began to swim toward Alcatraz, not as an escape from the island prison, as so many had attempted in years past, but as a return to a new home, a new existence, a transformation that he had fought against but could no longer resist. The waters closed over him without a sound, accepting him as they had accepted others before him, drawing him down into depths where human limitations were shed like outgrown clothes, and ancient entities welcomed another intermediary into their evolving communion with the world above.